Welcome to Let's Talk Para, the podcast where we talk about all things para sport. I'm Yasmina Isa, a para badminton player, and I'm thrilled to bring you inspiring stories from athletes, coaches, researchers, and everyone shaping the para sport movement. If you're passionate about para sport or just hearing about it now, join me each episode as we delve into the world of para sport. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Para, where we talk about all things para sport. Joining me today is Mike Hutchinson. Mike is the Athlete Services Manager at ParalympicsGB. Mike, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Mike, let's take it back to the very beginning, because obviously you've been involved within para sport for quite a few years now.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved within para sport?
To be honest, very much kind of ever so slightly by chance, really, from the very beginning. So my first involvement with parasport was back in 2011. So at the time I was doing my undergrad in sport and exercise science down at the University of Bath. As my placement year, so my third year of that was a placement year, which I actually did with ParalympicsGB. So, and that was in the lead up to the year that finished with the London 2012 Paralympic Games. So, a fantastic opportunity to be involved in that year as a within British Paralympic sport. But ultimately has kind of set me then on the journey of where I am now and everything that has then gone on and happened to get to this point. So, following that, carried on to move up to Loughborough to then do my master's, PhD, continue studying all in with a para disability sport theme of it. From that point, parasport has been a pretty key part of my journey altogether.
Yeah, so I know after your master's you were involved with the Peter Harrison Centre.
That's right.
So could you tell me a bit about the work you've done with the Peter Harrison Centre and the kind of work, why is that work important within the Paralympic movement?
Yeah, so I mean, the Peter Harrison Centre itself played a hugely pivotal role in my progress and development and journey, really. So within that placement year is when I met Professor Vicky Tolfrey, who's the director of that centre, and was a large part of the reason for why I then wanted to come up to Loughborough to continue on. So following my master's there, I then joined the centre as a part-time lab technician, research assistant, and then did my PhD there as well. So I think it was, for me, to be part of a centre whose core mission is to focus on para-disability sport, exercise, health, performance-related research, and then ultimately looking to translate that research into kind of either applied practice or to influence policy and decision making and things, I think is a very unique thing and unique centre in terms of what it looks to do. So to be part of that was fantastic. Lots of amazing people have gone through that centre and have gone on to lots of various different things as well. So I think if we look at the breadth of also what they do, so I think to have been a part of that was a great thing for me to be able to do.
Yeah, so obviously, since your undergrad up until your PhD, you things shifted and you were heavily involved within parasport. And then after your PhD and working with the Peter Harrison Centre, you then moved on to work for ParalympicsGB. Yeah. So within your, what does your role basically entail within ParalympicsGB then? Yeah,
so my role is, I'm our lead for classification. So that's my primary area of responsibility is in classification. Ultimately, that comes down to leading the development and then the delivery of our classification strategy, which has a very key role in supporting the overall aims of the whole organisation of ParalympicsGB. Yeah. So within ParalympicsGB, we have two very clear objectives that we're looking to achieve as an organisation. The first of that is to send a best prepared team to the Paralympic Games, summer and winter. And the second of those is to achieve lasting societal change for disabled people in this country. So my work within classification more naturally fits to the kind of the best prepared team aspect of what we're looking to do as an organisation. But within the strategy itself, it's a really wide range of work, different work programs that we're looking to achieve. So ultimately, some of it is just clearly about supporting our sports and our national governing bodies, so that whichever athletes they want to be able to take to the games, they are able to, and they're successfully classified and are in the class that they're kind of hoping that they is kind of right for them. But then we have a lot kind of wider range of programs as well instead. So lots of focus on education. Education is absolutely key within classification. And then also supporting governing bodies on their national classification policies and processes as well. So there may be things in there in terms of, it might be things like developing rules and regulations, or it might be supporting them to recruit and train classifiers, who are the people that deliver classification. So yeah, a really, really broad range of stuff that we kind of comes under our remit, which makes it very exciting. No 2 days are the same, that's for sure.
So you're one of the first people that comes onto this podcast that's like focused on classification.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ask a very basic question. What is classification? If you were to explain it to someone who didn't know what classification was, how would you define classification, and why is it so important for the Paralympics? Because it's not in the Olympics.
It's not in the Olympics, although it's not in the Olympics in the form that it's in the Paralympics. I think this is maybe something that is not always appreciated, is that actually classification in one form or another is in other forms of non-disabled sport. Yeah. So for example, take any of the combat sports, for example. We have classification in those sports, but by the creation of weight categories. Yeah. So classification exists in a number of different guises, depending on the context where we find it. So within parasport, classification is there it serves a couple of key purposes. So the first purpose that it serves is it defines who is eligible to compete. So by that, what I mean is there are certain impairment types that are considered eligible for parasport. They certainly don't reflect all the different types of impairment that there are. So there are people who have an impairment, they are disabled, they have an impairment, but it's one that's not considered eligible within the Paralympic Games or for parasport. So that's the first purpose. It defines who is eligible. The second function is then for those people that are eligible, it groups them into classes. It groups categories called sport classes for the purpose of competition, based on the impact that the impairment has on key tasks and activities within a sport. Yeah. So what that then means is that within a sport, there are different categories that people compete within. The aim of those categories is to have people with similar levels of impairment and that cause the same impact on performance to be competing against each other, with the ultimate aim of minimizing the impact of impairment on the outcome of competition. So what we therefore mean by that is so that if we're watching some parasport, if we're watching the Paralympic Games, anything like that, the winner of that competition, the victor has done so not because they're less impaired than their competitors, but because they were the person that performed best on the day, who's optimized their training, their equipment, their nutrition, their psychological, their various psychological factors. So that ultimately is the aim, is to allow people with an impairment to compete on as much as possible an equitable basis against their competitors. So that's
no, I think that's a pretty good definition. So I'll play devil's advocate for a bit then, because you said
like it
in the beginning you said eligible impairments, right?
Yeah.
So obviously a lot of people, sometimes they're no longer eligible to play or anything like that. So I think the IPC often because the IPC generally is the governing body for, we'd say, classification.
That's right, yeah. So the International Paralympic Committee, they're the governing body for the Paralympic movement. Yeah. They publish the classification code, which kind of sets the framework, which then individual sports, so the international federations for a sport kind of govern each individual sport. They in developing their rules then have to comply with that code, with the IPC's code.
So like when athletes are no longer able to, like they're not eligible then, but they're disabled, they'll never be able to compete, non-disabled. So does that in a way make it exclusive, kind of the Paralympic move or the classification system?
Definitely, definitely it is, and it's a common challenge that's put to kind of people that work within classification is that a perception, not a perception. The Paralympic movement as a whole is about inclusivity. It's about increasing access to sport for disabled people, for people with impairment. So it can seem a little bit of a conflict that then we have a classification system that limits who can compete. And I understand that, and I agree with that, and I can understand kind of where people come from when they challenge that. The reason that classification is necessary is that without it, parasport can't achieve the aims of what the movement is looking to achieve. And without classification, the competition ultimately wouldn't be meaningful. Because without classification, if we opened it up to, if there was just single classes, for example, so you still had the Paralympic Games, but there was no classification, so any disabled athlete was competing against any other disabled athlete, the victors, the people that win, are the more likely to do so just because they are less impaired than other people, and not because they're a better athlete. So, and it's the same in Olympic sport, Paralympic sport. We want the competition to be meaningful. We want to know that the person that crosses the line first, or that jumps the highest or the furthest, or reaches the wall first, has done so because they're the best athlete that's performed the best on the day. Yeah. Classification enables that to happen. Yes, it prevents some people from being able to compete. We have to acknowledge that. And that there are challenges with that. Absolutely. Yeah. But without classification, ultimately, parasport wouldn't be able to exist. Yeah,
because it is basically the backbone of parasport. Cause
absolutely.
For me, the first thing I did was I need to make sure I was eligible to compete in order to be able to compete. So it is definitely the backbone. Do you think within the same category, there often, even within a category, let's say someone's classified as something, do you think there's within the same category people who are less impaired and more impaired?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And the reason for that is impairment exists on a continuum. So it's not just a case of you have one or you don't. And it can be the case. I'm non-disabled. I don't have an impairment, so I currently would never be eligible for the Paralympic Games. But even for people that do have an impairment, that impairment can vary in terms of the level of it. So the challenge that classification systems have, and this is why research is so important into classification, is that and because we need to have different classes, because again we need to make it, and that's why I said earlier, as equitable as possible. Yeah. Because it's never, I don't believe it would be ever get to a point where things can be truly equitable. Yeah. The challenge that we have to do is the lines between different categories have to be drawn somewhere. So no matter where you draw those lines, there's always still going to be a range of impairment levels within that class. The challenge that you then have is you want to make sure that the classes are broad enough that you have a sufficient number of people then competing in that class to make the competition viable. So we can't have so many classes that there's only 2 or 3 people in each one, because all of those then can't be in the games because there's a limited number of events and things like that. But at the same time, we can't have the classes too broad that then the range of impairments are too broad, and that there are some people at the lower end who would then reasonably not have a chance of competing just because they're more impaired. So there's a real challenge there for classification, and is why it will never be perfect, but it always needs to be able to evolve and learn and develop where new information is found out or researched or discovered, so that it stays, or it continues to be as fair as possible for all of those involved.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think sometimes when I speak to other people, they'll be like, I think those people should be in another category. But then they point out like 5 people. So I'm like, so we're starting a category for 5
For
people.
5 people.
So that's not really then, because obviously within the same impairment, everyone is different, and you'll have people that are naturally stronger, naturally built different, and that's gonna make a difference. So you mentioned the part about the importance of research within classification, and obviously you were involved with the research side before getting into ParalympicsGB.
Yeah.
So what kind of research has been done within classification, and what impact did it have on the classification system?
Yeah. So I have been involved in a number of projects from a classification perspective. So one of the very first ones I did when I joined Loughborough was we were involved with paracanoe. So paracanoe is a sport that's got 2 different types of boats, and this was pre-Rio. So they were striving for inclusion in Rio. They had developed a lot of research within one of those boats, but the other boat, because of the nature of the movement, is very different. So it has to have its own classification system compared to the other boat. So we were involved in assisting the team in conducting that research. So that didn't lead to the inclusion before Rio, but it did then get added in for Tokyo. And effectively what that research was looking to do was to understand the impact of impairment on performance in that sport. So we were able to measure impairment. We were able to measure performance in the sport. We can then effectively look at the relationship between those two things. Yeah. And then in that situation, we could run some fairly complex stats. I won't try to explain it now. I don't know if I fully understand it myself, but to try and effectively then try and work out, well, what is the ideal class structure? How many classes should there be? Where should those lines be between the different classes? And then a real challenging thing is to then actually translate that research into instructions for classifiers to then be able to then say, well, okay, how do you need to assess people? Based on those assessments, what are the criteria that they were then using to actually assign someone a class? So that's kind of one model of research that we did. Later down the line, we were involved in a project with the IWBF, so Wheelchair Basketball's International Federation. So they were having some challenge at the time with having what's called minimum impairment criteria. Yeah. So this defines the smallest level of impairment that someone has to have to be eligible for a sport. At the time, there weren't any published criteria within that sport. So we assisted in conducting some research. That was a survey-based study with experts in the field and within the sport to kind of try and understand what those impairment minimum criteria should be, and then again go through a translational process to be able to implement those research findings into practice. So a range of kind of both qualitative and quantitative research going into classification. Some I think of the extremely interesting work that's being done at the moment is into kind of experiences of classification, both from an athlete's perspective, obviously hugely importantly. There's also been some really interesting work being done recently by some researchers down in Bath into classifier experiences of the process as well, and kind of understanding how they view their role within the process. For me, these things are vitally important to know to be able to inform training programs or educational programs, or just general work in the area of classification. So we're not just looking at the systems themselves and how valid and reliable they are, but we're looking at people's experiences of the process to inform how we should actually deliver classification in the future as well.
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of research being done, and you mentioned about the experience of the classifier. So the classifier is under a lot of scrutiny. Yeah. And for a lot of athletes, that could be their worst nightmare, because that could be the person that stops them from competing, but it could also be the person that allows them to compete. For a classifier, what would you say, because they have to obviously do their job to make sure that this person is eligible, because like you said, you need an equitable playing field. So what would you say a lot of times is the biggest challenge a classifier faces when it comes to an athlete?
I think it's balancing their balancing the role. And this is, to be honest, this is what the research shows, is that they have a process that they have to follow. There's a rule book that they have to follow. There's a manual that they have as a classifier in their sport, and ultimately they have an obligation to the movement. Again, you know, classification has to serve its purpose, and to make sure that that parasport is meaningful and is having the desired effect. But at the same time, they know that they can see sometimes the impact of what they're doing, and they're doing everything exactly as they should be by the rule book. But the impact that can have on athletes, I don't think can be understated, because those impacts can be huge, and classifiers are acutely aware of that. But it can be very difficult sometimes for them to be able to deliver the very important role that they need to do, whilst also considering the person at the heart of that's going through it. And you know, classifiers are fantastic. They have an extremely difficult role, but all the people that do it, they're often giving up their own time to do it, you know, and things like that. They're all busy professionals, highly experienced professionals, either from a technical or medical perspective. But you know, they're brilliant people. They absolutely are, which is why we need to do as much as we can to support them to deliver that role. Because they can often be seen as the bad guys, and that's not fair on them.
No, it's definitely not fair on them. No, I agree. Like, you know, their roles, there's a lot of pressure. Riding on that. So in terms of like for the athlete, there could be. Not saying this happens with all athletes, but you know, there could be, I think, a temptation to cheat the classification system. So how common do you think that often happens within parasport then?
It's a brilliant question, and it's one that lots of people toy with, to be honest. I think, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I think it would be naive of us to think that people wouldn't try and cheat the system, and it would be that's the case, because there are cases where people have been sanctioned for cheating. So they have been found guilty for trying to cheat within classification. But I think it's probably also fair to say that the number of prosecuted cases would not necessarily match what many people would think to be the scale of the problem. So I think the general perception is that there are more people cheating than have been caught. Now, just because there's a perception that more people are cheating than have been caught doesn't necessarily mean that there is. So I think, and I don't think we have anything at the moment to inform what the prevalence of potential cheating could be. And I think that's where, so it's really difficult to understand that, because I don't think we have any data or knowledge to truly be able to understand it. Is it something that needs to be taken seriously? Absolutely, like definitely. You know, no one would have any question that doping is bad in sport, Olympic or Paralympic. So you know, that the same, it's an integrity issue that we're talking about in relation to classification cheating. So you know, we certainly have to take it seriously and prosecute cases where it can be proven. But understanding the scale of the challenge, I think, is one that we don't have a good grasp on at the moment. I remember when I spoke to you before this, you mentioned something, and I thought that one was quite interesting. Sometimes athletes don't want to get stronger, you said, because I think that would mean they'd move up in their category. You know, it's a conversation that I've definitely heard before, where people have maybe thought, well, if I do get stronger, so if I'm a newer athlete, for example, like I'm coming into parasport, and I start to train, and I do the sport, I'm in the gym, and I'm training properly, maybe where I haven't done before. If that makes me stronger, is that going to change my class? And therefore, well, actually, should I not train as much? So therefore, I stay where I am at the moment. Well, you know, I think to me, this shows where education and awareness is so important, because if classification works properly, no matter what work you do in the gym or on the training, in your training, shouldn't make any difference to the class that you get allocated into.
Yeah.
The assessments of impairment that happen in classification should be resistant to training, so they shouldn't change. If we're measuring impairment correctly, we're not measuring training status of the athlete, of the person. So whether someone has newly acquired an injury, or whether they've always had that injury or that impairment and have been a para athlete for years, it shouldn't make any difference if we're using valid and reliable measures of impairment within the process, which is, for me, is exactly why education and awareness is so key.
Yeah, because I think your impairment, I think you can maximize what you get out of your impairment, but I don't think by training more you can change or adapt the impairment. Because
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it.
Yeah. So looking forward into if we look at future of classification, where would you like to see the future of classification going, in terms of 2028 into 2028 and 2032? And I know obviously the Winter Paralympic Games as well.
I think it's a really exciting time for classification. So for those of us in the world, there's a new code in place that came into effect this year. So there's a new developed framework that sports need to be working to. So kind of all sports will naturally, as a result of that, be going through a little bit of change in terms of some of what they may need to do. I think there's huge potential in terms of where classification can go. I think for me, some of the larger areas for development could be around how we deliver classification, and how we talk about it, how open we are about it. Again, there's a lot of research that shows that, particularly from an athlete's perspective, it's almost considered a bit of a taboo subject, and that almost they're discouraged from talking about classification. They're like, we don't talk about this thing. If we want something to develop, if we want something to get better, I don't know how that can be achieved if we don't talk about it, and particularly if we're not seeking the input and the athlete perspective on things. The impact of classification is always on the athlete that's going through it. So we have to understand that athlete voice. So being able to better do that, I think, is something where I think classification can continue to evolve. And again, similarly, like we were talking about before, in terms of that kind of understanding those perspectives and the environment in which it's delivered. So a conversation that we've been having recently is classification can come across a very kind of medical model. The focus is all on the impairment, the athlete's impairment. And wanting to measure that and kind of interrogate it. And I understand that, and that's it's needed, it's necessary.
Yeah.
But at the same time, with a greater kind of acceptance and use of, for example, the social model of disability, and I think could be very interesting how classification may need to evolve to kind of take account of some of those factors, and not just have such necessarily. And take a bit more of a holistic view, not necessarily in the decision-making process, because of other factors that we've kind of spoken about, but in terms of how we support athletes before, during, after, how we create the environment in the delivery of classification to support positive experiences of it. Yeah. Everyone will be going into classification with their own kind of historical lived experiences. Will have their own things going on in those moments where they're being classified, and it's a moment where there's an intense focus on their impairment that they've got. So that can be really difficult for people going through that. So I think any way that we can evolve what we do to make that a better experience and a more positive experience for them, then I think that's ways that we need to look to continue how we develop things as well. Yeah.
And obviously you said with the research coming out, I think that could play a big role into it, because a lot of that research is directly linked to international federations or the IPC or all that. So they do take a lot of that into consideration, right?
I think it's always a challenge, and probably coming from a bit of my academic background, lots of people maybe think that lots of research findings don't necessarily find their way into updating or refreshing policy or practice and things. But I think for those of us in in these sorts of roles, such as I'm in at the moment, it's really important that we understand the work that's being done, and then do take that to inform what we're doing, rather than it being people like myself thinking about what we think needs to happen. We actually need to understand what does need to be happening, and then doing that. So, because I think often it can come very across as classification is a thing that's being done to athletes, whereas it shouldn't. For me, I don't think it should be that. It should be something that's done with them.
Yeah.
And with that, and at the moment, do we capture that athlete voice well enough and listen to it and change things necessarily? Then you could probably challenge that.
Fair enough. If you had a take-home message, if you wanted someone to come away with a take-home message about classification, what would it be?
Engage with it. Talk about it. It shouldn't be a taboo subject. We need to. I think a lot of the time, when people maybe have more negative things to say about classification, I think often, not always, but probably often, it comes from a place of maybe not having a full awareness of the process of what's going on. So let's engage with it. Let's talk about it more. Let's be more open about what classification is, what it does, what it's there for. Break down some of those barriers. Increase the knowledge base around it, so we can have then much more informed conversation about it moving forwards.
Because I think the negative stories is what you hear, because they're the ones out. No one's gonna say, "Oh, I've been classified as this."
Yeah.
No one's gonna come out and say that about classification, that they're thankful that they got classified. But it's always the negative stories that you go out and hear it. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's obviously a lot of good work being done within classification, 100%. And a lot of people got given an opportunity, especially if they've acquired a disability that they never thought would happen. But through the classification system, we're able to compete at whatever level they wanted to compete at.
You're absolutely right.
So on that note, I will ask you a few classification trivia questions.
Okay.
Which...
No pressure.
No pressure at all. Can't find okay, there it is. Cool. All right. I'll ask the question and see if you can answer it. If not, there is multiple choice, so I can give you the multiple choice.
Okay.
Which internationally recognized medical model serves as the basis for determining classification eligibility in the Paralympic system?
So, well, I would guess World Health Organization, so International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I thought your answer was World Health Organization. I was going to be like, that wasn't even an option, but that is
cool.
The correct answer.
Lovely.
Cool. Well, off to a strong start.
Good start.
Which sport has the most complex classification system involving a combination of muscle testing, range of movement, and field trials? We'd like some options.
Well, complexity could be quite subjective, couldn't it?
I could give you some options.
I mean, you could probably put a lot of sport. To be honest, I'm interested in what the options are.
Powerlifting, para-athletics, wheelchair rugby, and para-Nordic skiing.
Oh, okay. So not powerlifting. That's less. That's simpler. It could be any of the others, to be honest. I'm actually going to go with wheelchair rugby.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So the explanation is classification is based on a detailed functional assessment and game observation.
Yeah, I think there's arguments for all of those sports in there.
Yeah, but you still got it right. So, okay, 1 second. In what year did the IPC formally adopt the athlete evaluation process to standardize classification procedures?
Oh, good question. The first classification code, I believe, was published in 2007.
Yes.
That was then updated in 2015.
Yeah, so both are actually options, but 2007 is the correct answer.
That was the first one.
Okay.
Oh. This is making me feel good about myself.
To be fair, doing quite well. You're doing quite well. I'm trying to find a hard one. Okay. What is a unique challenge in para-equestrian compared to other Paralympic sports? Unique classification challenge.
Oh, okay. I mean, I was going to say, well, there's a horse involved. No, it's not the only one that does that. They combine athletes with a physical impairment compete alongside those with a visual impairment, but that's the same in rowing as well. So I don't know.
It says the involvement of an animal in performance evaluation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
To be fair, okay, that was...
We did say there was a horse
Yeah.
involved.
We'll end on this one. What are the key principles outlined in the IPC classification code?
The key principles?
Yeah. The 3 key principles.
The 3 key principles? Oh my goodness. I don't know. I might need some help on this one.
All right. So you've got options.
Okay.
A, eligibility, fairness, integrity.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say B because that's... C, impairment, activity, limitation, participation, restriction.
Okay.
D, transparency, evidence-based practice, and sustainability.
Oh, that's tough. A or C?
Yeah.
Yeah. A. I'll go A.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So out of all the questions I've asked, you have answered them all correctly. So
does that mean I can keep my job?
No, I think yeah, that was pretty comprehensive of the classification system. I think I didn't want to get too much detail into the sports, but yeah, Mike, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
And thank you for talking about all things classification, and hopefully someone learns a thing or two.
I hope so. About
classification. But yeah, thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.